Welcome back, everyone, to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We're here now with Dr. Rachel Herz. She's a Brown professor. She's a leading expert on the psychology of smell, and she has a newly released book called Why You Eat What You Eat. Absolutely fascinating. Congratulations on the book, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, sort of in a larger sense, I look at how our senses and our mind, our motivations, our emotions, our behaviors are all intertwined, and the influences that shape our relationship with the world around us that are mediated through our senses and our psychology.
And so what inspired you to take all of that, all of your research, and make it into this fabulous book?
Well, the sense of smell, as you probably can tell, is very related to our experience of food. In fact, what we call taste is really flavor 99% of the time, and that basically comes from our nose, because taste is just salt, sour, sweet, and bitter. The flavor of bacon, everything that makes bacon not salt, actually comes from your nose. Likewise, chocolate is just sweet, maybe a little bitter. Everything else has to do with your nose. And so I wrote my first book, which was about the sense of smell, called The Scent of Desire. The next book I wrote was called That's Disgusting, and believe it or not, disgust is a taste-based emotion.
Really?
It actually evolved out of our rejection of bitter taste, and the face you make if you taste something really bitter, and I tell you to hold your neighbor's dirty dentures, is actually the exact same face. And so with those two prior pieces of work, I have always loved food. I love food, I love to eat, and I felt like, okay, now I have to get into what I really, really am passionate about, which is eating and food.
That's so fascinating. You never think that, because even if we're not smelling something, even if we just see something that we don't like, it's the same reaction.
You mean in terms of disgust or in terms of everything? Well, yeah, so yes, exactly. So from the point of view of our emotion of disgust, if you saw, for example, some snakes and you didn't like snakes, you would make the same face as you would if you tasted something bitter. And so, or even if you thought about immoral politicians or terrible things happening that you were really emotionally disgusted by, you actually make a similar kind of a face. So there's this really interesting interplay between this sort of very rudimentary avoidance of poison, because the reason why we make that face is because it's actually a rejection face. It's about spitting something out or not letting something in, and that's about making sure that poisons from the outside don't come into our inside. And it evolves all the way up to psychosocial kinds of things.
That is absolutely fascinating. And so what were some of the other interesting findings that you that you put in the book?
Well, let's see, there's so many, I can't really think of them, but one of the things I really find amazing, that was actually amazing to me when I was doing the research for this book, is really how powerful the mind is in terms of controlling not just our perceptions on kind of a basic level, but even our physiology. And there was this amazing study done at Yale by Alia Crum, who's now at Stanford University, and she actually basically produced a placebo effect with milkshakes. And as a function of people believing in one situation that they were consuming a really, really caloric milkshake, compared to in another situation where they had the exact same milkshake but they thought it was really low calorie, in the high calorie condition, their metabolisms revved up 3 times more than they did in the low calorie condition, and in both cases actually not related to the reality of the calories. And so that actually showed that our mind controls our metabolism. And so the trick is to convince yourself that what you're consuming has tons of calories, even if it doesn't, so your metabolism will be revved up. That is to say, if you want that.
That's fascinating. Yeah, great new weight loss tip. Just tell yourself that your kale is terrible for you, and you'll be fine.
Oh my God, that kale! I should have it for dessert instead of lunch.
Oh, such an indulgence.
Yes.
And so you had a write-up in the Brown Alumni Magazine, and there were some fascinating tidbits in there as well. And if I'm correct, so if you like salt, that can be traced back to your mother when she was pregnant. Is that correct?
Well, potentially. So that's just one avenue. I mean, the basic thing when it comes to salt, actually, salt is a taste that we inherently tend to like, but it's sort of dose dependent. Salt triggers or signals usually the presence of protein. So from the point of view of like bitter is a signal for poison, sweet is actually a signal for carbohydrates and calories that are really useful, and protein is usually signaled by salt, so that's also really good. But how much salt you like is based on your experience. So the more salt you consume, the more salt you like, the more salt you want, the more salt you use, and get into kind of a vicious circle. But from the point of view of how much salt you use, that could actually be something which starts even before you're born. because what your mother is consuming is getting into amniotic fluid, and you're absorbing that and consuming that while you're gestating. And so this research was really, really amazing, which showed that mothers who had experienced a lot of morning sickness, and by that the idea is that they were dehydrated from a lot of vomiting, and when we're dehydrated, we're actually low in salt, we lose salt, so we actually need more salt. As a function of that, it's unclear whether potentially mothers then actually ate a lot more salt than mothers who didn't have a lot of morning sickness, or because potentially this deprivation state actually also influenced the developing child, such that when they were born, they had more of a craving for salt. So in any event, it was shown that children of mothers who had experienced a lot of morning sickness when they were in college actually preferred higher quantities of salt than children of mothers who didn't have a lot of morning sickness. And also infants right after they were born, mothers who had a lot of morning sickness, they preferred salted water compared to plain water. So there seems to be something about this early exposure that sets the stage for liking more salt and then wanting more salt.
Absolutely fascinating. And so that plays into as well, especially here in Rhode Island, we have such a rich food culture here in Providence. That plays into as well the idea, the science of smell and experience of your food. That plays into it as well. You know, if you have a plate of food and it smells really good and it looks really appealing and you've been thinking about it all day, you're going to be more likely to really enjoy it.
Absolutely. So from the point of view of our sense of smell, actually, so smell is a wonderful trigger for food. So you smell the aroma of a restaurant while you're walking by and you're like, wouldn't it be nice to eat something, even if you're not necessarily hungry. So sometimes it can lure us by the nose when we may not always want it to. But it's also the case, actually, that people who have a fully functioning sense of smell are better at maintaining their nutrition and their weight than people who are losing their sense of smell or who've lost it or have an impaired sense of smell in some ways. Because the fact that you get the flavor and the richness of food from your nose, having it makes you feel more satiated and satisfied. So if you have lost your sense of smell, food doesn't have that same delicious quality, so you tend to actually go for more of things like sweet and fat and salt, which tend to be higher calories and not necessarily the most nutritious. Whereas if you have your sense of smell, you get fabulous flavor, but you can also be lured to the donut shop or the restaurant or the cinnamons and so forth when you might not want to be.
Oh, absolutely. I know I can't possibly walk through the mall without smelling those delicious pretzels and thinking, ooh, maybe I should get one.
Yeah, exactly.
And so your research, what kind of stuff do you like to study? I mean, of course, the science of smell, but specifically, what kind of projects have you worked on?
So the main aspect of my work has to do with how smells trigger more emotional and evocative memories than memories that are triggered by any of our other senses. And so I've done quite a lot of work with that, and actually some recent work on smell that I've done connected to that at Brown University also showed for the first time that our ability to smell actually changes at different times of day, and this has to do with our circadian phase that we're in at the time. And so unlike what we might assume as far as we know about all of our other senses, you can see just as well at 9 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it turns out with our sense of smell that's not the case. And actually our worst ability to smell is between, on average, about 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. in the morning. And this actually has also very significant implications for being woken up by a fire or some other kind of a danger, and why it's really important to have things like auditory fire alarms and other sorts of work devices like that. And I've also done some really interesting recent work at the University of Pittsburgh, the collaboration with Dr. Michael Syett, looking at how pleasant odors can actually help with cravings for people who are trying to quit smoking. And so sort of tying that in also because of the emotional and the associative qualities of it.
So talking about scent memory, which you spoke about a minute ago, it's true that scents definitely bring us back. You smell something, it reminds you of, oh, this reminds me of my grandmother's house, this reminds me of Christmas when I was a kid. Is it true that scent is one of the strongest indicators? I know I've read before, you know, if you're trying to study for a big test, like chew a certain gum, and then if you chew it the next day, it'll help you remember.
Yes, actually did some research showing that quite a long time ago. But so the idea, it's not exactly the strongest. So the thing with smell is that it is one of the things that you can use it for, from example, the testing situation, is to find a smell that you don't already have a prior association to. So not something really common, not like coffee or the cologne perfume that you wear every day. So you find a different smell, and because it can be very uniquely tied to the specific information you're studying at the time, it can then become a really good cue for reminding you of that information later on. So for example, if you had a particular test that you were studying for and you got an unusual fragrance to go along with studying for it, bring that fragrance in for that test, but don't bring it into a different test you haven't studied for, that won't work. And the idea behind our ability to smell and memory is that because of the way in which our sense of smell is hooked up in the brain to the emotional, memory, and associative areas, it is able to trigger memories that are more emotional and evocative than memories triggered by any other kind of cue.
Absolutely fascinating. And a lot of times you think, oh, smell, like it's not that important. Like it's more important to see or to touch. But it's really fascinating how pervasive it is and how much it affects everything you do.
Well, it actually really is tied to every aspect of our lives. It's tied to our social behavior, it's tied to intimacy, actually especially for women, it's tied to our sense of self because it's so highly connected to memories and emotion. It's tied to our safety, personally, with respect to things like, detecting spoiled food or being able to smell gas. And it's tied to our emotional life in a really, really special and importantly deep way that none of our other senses are. So unfortunately, it's the case that if people lose their sense of smell in some kind of traumatic accident, then they are overwhelmed by how shocked they are that they never really took their sense of smell to be as important as it is. And so I always want people to take the time to stop and smell the roses.
Literally.
Yes. Or the cupcakes or the donuts.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It's absolutely fascinating. Be sure to check out her book. And where can we find this?
Anywhere books are sold.
All right. So go check it out, a great new beach read, and you can find out why you eat, what you eat. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Rachel Herz. We'll be right back with our next guest right here in the Navigant Credit Union.